Welcome to our podcast, Raising Bigs. This podcast is an ongoing conversation between myself and my young adult son. We're ready and willing to talk about all the things families might experience in their lives and relationships, both as parents and young adults, from teens to 20-somethings, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. In this episode, we're talking about burnout. It could be school, work, parenting, or life in general that has you feeling depleted. You're overwhelmed, and every day feels like a repeat of the one before. It's all too much, and you've switched to survival mode. Let's dive into this discussion. I'm Marcy, and I'm the mom.
I'm Cade, and I'm her kid. Burnout hits all of us at some point in life, but it doesn't have to be an ongoing status for anyone. You don't always need to feel burnt out. That shouldn't be the norm. If you're feeling the heat from burnout, you might be isolating yourself, lashing out in frustration on those around you, pulling away, or sometimes even just completely falling apart. But instead, bigs and their parents can help each other to lighten the load when life has gotten too heavy and that burnout has started to set in. Mom, I know there's a lot of moving parts to manage as a parent. You've got your own individual life, your child's life, a family relationship, all of that to navigate. When have you experienced burnout in your lifetime?
I think the most common times when I felt burnout was when there were just a lot of balls in the air. I think as parents, like you said, you've got your own life to maintain. Sometimes you have a job, or sometimes you're at home taking care of the kids. You might be in school. You might have your own social circles that you like to hang out with. You might have some hobbies. And then you're trying to manage a household and a family. And when those kids get big, they have tons of activities. And so
Mhm.
I remember a point in time when you guys were all like that high school to middle school age, and there were 15 different directions people had to get all the time, right? And all the back and forth to all the activities. And I was still working a full-time job at that time. And so I think if ever there was a time in my life where I was the most overwhelmed and the most burnt out, it was probably during that time when I was working a highly stressful job that required a lot of hours, as well as trying to balance what was going on in the family.
Mm.
There are times where like work required more of me, and there were times that family required more of me. And for years, I was trying to the work-life balance. You hear that? And instead, I think it's really a work-life blend. It took me years
Mhm.
to learn that. But those were the times when I felt the most burnt out. And I think in the state of burnout, usually you start to feel stuck or trapped. And so that's what kind of keeps you on that hamster wheel of doing the same thing day after day. You lose sight of the ways that you could lower the stress, lower the emotion, change your environment, those types of things. So I think when you are a parent and you're kind of on that hamster wheel and just, getting through and trying to get everything done and all the boxes checked, and you're falling into bed exhausted at the end of the night, only to lay awake running the things through your head, so you're dealing with less sleep. I think those were the times in my parenting journey that I have felt the most burnt out. I don't feel that anymore now that you guys are on kind of the, higher end of the big spectrum. Like
Mhm.
you're all in your 20s and pretty much handling your own lives. But when I had a lot of you to keep track of and to make sure that you guys were all getting your needs met, that definitely led to periods of
For
burnout
sure.
in my life. So, Cade, young adults can also experience burnout. So, especially in a society where expectations can be so
Mhm.
high, parents deal with, oh, there's one right way to do this parenting thing, right? And all that competition between parents. But young adults have some really high expectations that they're trying to live up to for both society and for their parents, right? And sometimes even for themselves, if that's the way you're
Mhm.
wired. So when that pressure is really high, what kind of things have been going on in your life at times that you have felt burnout as a young adult?
For sure. I think kind of like you said when you were talking about you as a parent being feeling burnt out when you have, you're juggling multiple balls and you have multiple balls in the air at the same time. I think that's when I've always experienced burnout. It's not necessarily that one thing is weighing super heavy on me or, I'm having, it's just school that's a problem or just family that's a problem or just work that's a problem. For me, it's always just kind of been, I've got work, I've got school, I've got family, I've got, friendships, I've got relationships, I've got, trying to stay healthy. I've got all these things going on. So I think that sometimes that's where, at least from my perspective and my friend's perspective, is a lot of the times you're just burnt out because there's so much to do. And especially, when you're looking at like the high school age of kids and stuff like that, you're trying to be involved in multiple activities and still get good grades in school. And sometimes you're working, and then, you have your friendships and you have your social outings like prom and stuff like that. And so I think that there's just a lot going on for a lot of kids, especially in today's society. And I think that that leads to burnout for a lot of us. And I think a lot of times I think from what I've seen at least, is a lot of people my age either just work through the burnout and don't really realize that they're feeling burnt
Mm,
out until it's too late, or they just completely shut down. So I think that, at least for me, in my personal experience, and from talking to my friends and stuff like that are all of a similar age, that's when I experience burnout. It's just when there's a lot going on, and it seems like, okay, if I'm not at work, then I'm doing homework, and then if I'm not doing homework, I'm
mhm.
hanging out with my friends, and then if I'm not hanging out with my friends, I'm at the gym, and then I come home and I sleep for 5 hours, and I wake up, and then I get back to work, and then so I think that it's just kind of like you said, that cycle and that hamster wheel of just always feeling like there's something going on. So that's, I mean, I know when I've experienced burnout, for me at least.
Yeah, so much going on. And I know, we usually, when we go into these podcast episodes, we have a list of questions that we're working off of. But I want to throw something in here, Kate, that we didn't have in our list today, just so the viewers can get to know us a little bit. How do you personally, when you are dealing with burnout, what do you find yourself doing? How do you find yourself reacting that
Hmm.
maybe is not a positive way to work
For
through
sure.
that burnout?
Yeah. I think my initial reaction, and the way that I can always spot when I'm burnt out, is when I start putting things off, and when I start
Mhm.
spending more time just scrolling on my phone or things like that. So I always notice, when things start to pile up and I'm looking at, my calendar, my to-do list or whatever, and I'm thinking, okay, I've got this to do. And it just seems so overwhelming and like it's so much. Naturally, I just kind of fall into, okay, I have so much to do, so I just don't want to do anything, and I just,
Mhm.
want to sit on my phone, or I just want to sit and on the couch or whatever. And that, I've noticed, has been my tendency. So I've also kind of turned that into my, since that is my initial reaction, I've turned that as my signal to be like, okay, I'm feeling burnt out. What do I need to do?
Mhm.
So when I notice myself being like, okay, I know I've got homework, I know I've got work, I know I need to go to the gym, I know I need to do this, do that, do whatever, and I'm just not doing it, then I'm like, okay, something's wrong, because I know that that's not typically like me. Typically, I'm the kind of person that just gets up and does it and does what I need to
Mhm.
do and does the homework or shows up to work or whatever. So when I start kind of slipping down that path, that's kind of when I notice it. But what about for you, Mom? Kind of answering that same question. How do you notice
Yeah.
it?
That's really good insight, Kate, that you're kind of able to see when you're sliding into that burnout zone, right? And you're
Hmm.
noticing, you mentioned procrastination. And I didn't know until a couple years ago that, Mel Robbins was talking on her podcast and she was saying that procrastination is actually a stress response. I had been living my whole life thinking that was some kind of a personality default with myself, that I
Hmm.
tended to be a procrastinator. And now I realize that when I truly am procrastinating things, it's when I do feel under pressure, right?
Hmm.
And I do feel stressed. So that is really valuable insight. I too will do the procrastination thing. I will find a way to be doing anything except the things that I'm supposed to be doing. I can get really creative on things that I find to do when I really should be focused elsewhere. But I've also found that my body will let me know that I am in burnout mode. And usually it's in the form of getting sick, and it's getting sick suddenly. Like, I can think of, several times where I was in burnout mode, and either I like one time I got super, super sick really fast sitting in the chair at the hair salon, and like literally made one cut. That was it. And I got violently ill, had to go home, and I crawled in bed and pulled the covers up over my head for like 24 hours. My body just shut down. And I've
Hmm.
had that happen multiple times. And I said, you can only run full speed for so long before the wheels fall off, right?
Hmm.
And so if I had had the insight that you have now at your age, right, to
Hmm.
be able to see myself, okay, you're sliding into that dangerous place, right? You're recognizing the behaviors that you're doing. I would have maybe not gotten to the point where my body said, okay, it's time to shut down. So,
For sure.
I think more in the past it was the me getting sick. I think when I start to feel the burnout now, I too tend to recognize it when it's kind of in that overwhelm phase, which really strikes before
Hmm.
burnout. And I'll be like, I am totally overwhelmed. And we'll talk a little later in this podcast about some positive ways, right? That you can handle that before you get to the stage, or if you're recognizing you are already in the stage
Hmm.
of burnout.
For sure. So as a parent, what's it like, when maybe you either your child tells you they're feeling burnt out or you're starting to
Mhm.
pick up on some signs that, you might think they're being burnt out. What is that like as a parent?
Yeah, as your kids get bigger, it gets harder because you know that like they're very committed and dedicated to the things that they're doing that are leading to burnout. So I especially think of like in high school when that junior senior year when courses have gotten harder, a lot of kids are taking courses for college credit. They might be involved in a sport, or for you guys, you were all involved in show choir on multiple levels, right? At school, and then a competitive show choir outside of that, and then you still wanted to have time with family and time to have friends, and it's hard as a parent to watch your kid having all of these things that either need to do to contribute towards their future, right? Like you
Hmm.
wanted to take the college courses so that you could get out of college earlier, and it was much cheaper to do it that way, but it was an added load. And so not saying to your kid, you are doing too much, you need to slow your roll, like you would not have taken that well had
Hmm.
I come at you like that. But instead it was like, what can I do to help? And we can talk a
Hmm.
little bit more about that. But it's a little frustrating as a parent because you don't necessarily want to approach your child in a way that would seem like you're trying to control their choices that are leading
Hmm.
to that burnout. So I think it's helping them recognize where they're at and then helping them to figure out what their next best steps are to maybe take the pressure off a little bit or release
For
some of
sure.
that, you know, steam that's coming out of the
Hmm.
kettle. Like, how do you blow off some steam in the moment so you can kind of recharge and re-energize and be able to go back in from a better headspace, right?
Yeah. And
So
like you
as a
said,
parent, I think you can help your kid with that.
for sure. Like you said, it's about helping your kid and not, like taking over and going into, okay, let me just do it for you. I know, there's been several times where, especially as I've gotten older, and once you kind of had taught me, what burnout is and how to handle it, there would be times where I would tell you and I'd say, hey, I'm going to be working a lot this upcoming week and it's finals and it's Christmas time and it's blah, blah, blah. So, if I'm a little short or if I'm snappy or if, things like
Yeah,
that, and kind of, tell you as my parent, especially while I'm living with you and things like that. I think that can be beneficial. And obviously, that's something that took me time to
hmm,
realize that within myself. But I think once you kind of teach your kids to realize that, it can help both of you,
for
help you do
sure.
that because your kid is able to recognize that, tell you, and then you would turn around and say, okay, what can I do for you? And sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it's just, I just have to do what I have to do and get all these things done
Hmm.
and whatever. But other times it could be, okay, I'm not going to be able to do the dishes for the next week because I just have to spend all my time studying or things like that. So I think that there's ways that you can communicate that from the child and the parent perspective.
Yeah, and I love that kind of, hey, heads up, this is where I'm going to be, right now with this. And I think it's really important to remember that if you don't have those discussions ahead of time, it may not come out in a positive way
Hmm.
when all of a sudden your kid is falling apart or blasting you, with all of their frustration, even though it's not directed at you, that can come that way. So I like the idea of being able to communicate that. And that can also go the other way, right? Like if a parent knows that they're going to have a tough week at work or whatever, to be able to give them a heads up and say, hey,
Hmm.
I could use some extra help around the house this week, or can you pick up your brother this week after school, or whatever that might look like. So, Kate, I know, you were the youngest of three. So, from a young adult perspective, like, how does it feel when your parent is obviously dealing with burnout? You watched me like deal with that
Uh-huh.
live when all three of you were at home.
For sure. I think when I was younger, I was kind of oblivious to it, I would say.
Hmm.
And as I got older, I was able to pick up on one, I think as I got older, you would communicate more of, oh, I'm feeling this way, or,
Right.
I've got this busy week at work. But two, I think I was able to pick up more on the cues and say,
Hmm.
okay, I can tell that she's going to work at 6 a.m. and not coming home until 7 p.m. And,
Yeah.
things like that. You can kind of pick up on those cues. So I think that, as you get older, you kind of, even though you are the child, you kind of take on that responsibility of, okay, my parent is obviously busy at work or they're busy doing whatever it is
Hmm.
that, is burning them out, and saying, okay, what can I do? And whether that be cleaning the house or, helping cook dinner or helping do the dishes after dinner or things like that. I think as I got older, I kind of just realized little ways that I could kind of just squeeze myself in to help out. Again, I almost kind of like the same thing with the, parent helping the child, ways to help out without taking over and without, trying to get too involved in it. Cause sometimes that can just be an extra stress. If you're already worried about, work and your social life or whatever it is going on, and then your kid is always like, oh, well, what can I do to help? Or how can I do this or whatever? Sometimes then that can be another thing because even though they're helping, you're then turning around and having to tell someone something else.
Mhm.
And it's just a little extra work. So I think I was able to kind of just figure out, what I could do to help out and when I could help out. But it's also hard because a lot of, the problems that parents deal with, you're not able to solve as a child. So, Mom, how can a child help their parent who is struggling with burnout, whether that be taking something off their load, um, or what can they do? Because a lot of times, there's certain things kids can't help out with. If you've got a big
Right.
project at work, your kid's not able to do anything about that. So, what ways can a kid help out and maybe make that a little bit easier for their parent?
I think one of the first things you can do is just say, hey, mom, hey, dad, it seems like you're kind of stressed. It seems like maybe you've got a lot going on. Even just that acknowledgement, right? I think is important in families going both ways, right? But it's important for kids to see their parents as humans and to just acknowledge, hey, it seems like your load is really heavy right now. I think, not in a critical way, obviously, but in a way that's just compassionate
Hmm.
and might be helpful to them. I know, sometimes you guys would do things just to surprise me. Like I'd come home and the house would be cleaned, or the dog poop would have been picked up without me having to ask. Or sometimes, you guys swung past the grocery store once you had your driver's licenses and, we're having breakfast for dinner and I'd come home and it'd be made. And things like that, I think were helpful. If you're living away, then it gets a little harder sometimes to intuit that your parent might be struggling with something. But that checking in with them just to see, a lot of times conversations I think between parents and big when they're living away can become either all about the big, right? The parents asking all the questions because the kid is experiencing a lot of new things. And then they get to the end of their conversation and the parent's like, well, I guess they're not interested in what I've got going on,
Hmm.
right? So I think, taking that opportunity when you're on the phone with your parents to say, hey, what's going on in your world? And what does that look like? Like I think that can be really beneficial on both sides because you can learn from what your parents is experiencing. I do think parents need to have other support network people like friends and other family. They might have siblings they can lean on, their own parents they can talk to, because the responsibility to completely solve problems parents have, you're right, doesn't fall to their kids. Like that's not the growing kid's responsibility. But I think just from a caring perspective, like it helps to know that your child cares about you and
Hmm.
that, they want you to be happy too. They want you to have a quality life and it's not their job to necessarily fix it for you. But I think just being interested and aware when things are hard for your parent, and that can change as your parent gets older too. Like, if we were talking about you guys being in your 30s or your 40s and, I'm moving along and I'm in my 60s and my 70s, like knowing that there's different pressures and stresses there that
Hmm.
I haven't experienced, as an adult, but where my big could help me through that. So, kids, are there certain things a parent can do to support their kid that they see is in burnout mode that would be helpful?
For sure. Kind of like I said earlier, I think, just talking to your kid and asking what you need. A lot of kids don't want their parents to completely take over and, just, you know, jump into whole helicopter parent mode. But a lot of times, parents, like I said earlier, could help out by just saying, hey, mom and dad, I'm not going to be able to, do the dishes like I normally do. Or, could I eat with you guys, for dinner this
Mhm.
week because I'm not going to have time to cook my own meals or whatever the situation may be. I think asking your kid what they need and being open to that, because a lot of times it's not, oh, I need you to, take over and take this off my plate, but it's just little things that you can do along the way. So having that open line of communication can definitely be very beneficial. And then I think too, another thing parents can do is, and as hard as it sounds, is kind of let your kid go through that burnout mode.
Mhm.
Let them, learn the emotions of what it feels like. If you're always trying to stop them from feeling burnt out and you're always trying to stop them from getting to that point, they're never gonna be able to pick up on the signs of, when they're starting to feel burnt out. So then, later on in life, once they're in their 30s or 40s, or, once they're, a little bit more distant outside of your everyday life, you as the parent aren't going to be there to tell them, hey, you're getting towards the feeling of being burnt out. Let me help you out. And that can just lead to more
Mhm.
stress down the road. So as hard as it sounds, as a parent, you don't want your kid to suffer. You don't want them to, be in, not the best space. But I think it's in a way important for them, especially in that younger age, to feel that burnt out. Helps them, like I said, figure out those feelings and navigate them, as well as maybe helps them with time management and different things like that that they can learn along the way.
So I think it's really interesting, Cade, when you were talking about letting your child deal with the burnout mode, because it's true. If they never go through it, how are they ever going to develop that sense of saying, "Oops, I'm in overwhelm," or "I am in burnout, and I'm
Hmm.
seeing the signs in myself that that's where I am, and I need to actively do something to stop it," because ultimately that's the only way it stops, right? Or our body stops us, which
Hmm.
used to happen to me. But I think there's growth moments there for the parent to realize they have to just let their child experience it, but then be there on the other side of that to help
Hmm.
them learn, how do you recalibrate after you do have that meltdown, right? How do you then look at what's in front of you and reprioritize and figure out how you're going to fix it? How are you going to fix this burnout? Because if you don't make some changes, you're just going to find yourself, you're going to have the meltdown, and then you're going to go right back in. And 2 days later, you're chest deep again in whatever was going on in your life.
Hmm.
And it's never going to change for you. And it can shorten your lifespan, definitely, if you are constantly living in that burnout mode. And you're probably not real pleasant to be around, or you're probably, like we talked about, totally isolating. I know a lot
Hmm.
of people do that when they're stressful. So there are some healthy ways, though, to deal with burnout. Some parents might know them from experience, and sometimes it's the big that has fresh ideas about
Hmm.
how to deal with that burnout. So there's individual ways to deal with it, but then also ways that you can deal with it together as a family. So do you have any ideas, Kate, around how to constructively handle it individually?
For sure. I think individually, it really depends on who you are as a person. And that was kind of why I said I think it's important to experience that burnout and understand those feelings and understand how to navigate them. Because what works for me is not going to work for you. It might work for me to take a day and not do anything and then come back tomorrow and tackle everything all at once. And then
Mhm.
that might, help that feeling of being overwhelmed. But it might work for somebody else to just sit and tackle through it all and, knock it all out. It might work for somebody else that they need to tell, they need to look at a couple of those things on their to-do list and say, you know what, I can't do that, and I need to take that
Mhm.
off my plate. So whether that means passing it on to someone else or just saying that it's not going to get done, whatever it may be. So I think that it's important to figure out what works for you. But those are a couple ideas. There's some people who can just kind of dive right in and tackle whatever is going on and just kind of power through for a week or a month or however long it takes, and then once they're on the other side of it, they can kind of take
Mhm.
that moment to rest and relax. And there's other people who that doesn't work for them and they need to, look at that to-do list and say, okay, I need to take this thing off and this thing
Mhm.
off and this is going to have to wait. So I think that it's important to figure out what works for you and what tactic you can use to get the most benefit out for yourself. What
Yeah,
about you, Mom?
that prioritization, right, of we all talk about the to-do list, right? And whether it's
Hmm.
mental in your head or it's on your phone or it's handwritten, I know I'm probably in overwhelm when instead of actually doing something on my list, I turn to rewriting my to-do list. That is another
Hmm.
behavior that I would sometimes do. And so if you're actually looking at, let's say you think you have 10 things on your list today and you're feeling overwhelmed because you don't think there's any way you can do it, I bet if you look at that list, there are probably a couple of things that you can say that's a tomorrow problem, right? You
Hmm.
can move that to the next day. One of the best things my husband taught me, that's a tomorrow problem. Then there are probably a couple of things that you're like, is this really going to matter if this gets done at all? Or if this gets done this week or this month. So you might be able to just cross of your list altogether. And then one of the things that I have really tried to do when I'm feeling that sense of overwhelm is when I'm kind of wrapping up my day, whether that's a day sitting at my desk or whether that is a day at home at night, is to pick the top 3 things for the next day that will really be needle movers, right? That will help me feel like I've got stuff accomplished if I get them done the next day. So I'm going to bed that night with the idea already in my head. Don't worry about the 30 things on the list, worry about the 3. Because then when you
Hmm.
get the 3 done, you can always go back and pick another one, right?
Hmm.
Or three more if you have time. So kind of taking the big picture of overwhelm and trying to turn it into smaller bite-sized pieces. So for a parent, that might look like, okay, here's the top three things I have to get done at work. Here's the top three things I have to get done regarding my family. And here's
Hmm.
the top three things I need to do regarding myself, right? Because a
Hmm.
lot of times that gets neglected. Or for the big, it could be, here's what I have to do for my college classes. Here's what I have to do for my job. And my house is a mess. I haven't done my dishes. My dog needs a bath, whatever those things are, right?
Hmm.
So being able to figure out what are the three things that I need to focus on right now, I think is a really healthy way to kind of bring the level of that overwhelm down, because you do not have to do it all right
Hmm.
now. And I think sometimes we just get in that spin and it's hard for us to undo that. So kind of looking at those bite-sized pieces. And then I think also just removing yourself from the situation
Hmm.
for a period of time, whether that means you set a timer and you're going to read a good novel for 10 minutes, or you're going to take your dog and you're going to go on a quick 20-minute walk, or you're going to go sit out in that Adirondack chair in your backyard for
Hmm.
5 minutes with your bare feet in the grass and ground yourself. Like, I think there's a lot of individual activities you can do, but choose something that is either going to make the list shorter for you, at least in the short term, or that's going to help you reground and bring yourself down and
Hmm.
remind yourself of what's really important. I used to ask myself all the time, is this going to matter 5 years from now?
Hmm.
And if the answer was no, then it bumps down the priority list, right? If it wasn't something, and it's easy when you grow up and you have a house to maintain and you have a job and you have, especially on the at home front, it's like, well, that nail that's popped out of the wall that's like right next to me right here, that needs to be repaired,
Hmm.
right? That could be one thing on the list. But if that's not done still next year, is it really a big deal? Probably
Yeah,
not, right? So yeah, that prioritizing I think is really big. And then choosing some activities that bring you peace and calm. Sometimes you just need to go out in the backyard and you need to do what I call a primal scream, where you just you know, and you just let it all out. And as silly as that sounds and as goofy as it feels when you're doing it, there is something about that release. Or allow yourself to have a good cry when you're feeling overwhelmed. Like that is okay. And so those are all good individual ways to kind of let yourself recenter
hmm.
and refocus. How about together, Kate? Do you have any ideas about how a parent and their bigs could work through whether they're both overwhelmed? That happens sometimes because sometimes we pick up on each other's overwhelm and then it spreads. But or one of you is overwhelmed. How can you work through it together? What are some ideas you would have about that?
For sure. I think, kind of like talked about is having that open line of communication to figure out what the other person needs. If just one of you is feeling overwhelmed, maybe the other can do, something to take it off their plate. Or if, you're both feeling overwhelmed, that might look like, okay, if you are both are struggling to keep the house clean and, you still live together, talk about the younger bigs, then okay, you guys can take an hour together and clean the house together. And that way it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem as big of a deal. Or, if you're both, you know, whatever you're both stressed about, just take that time to do it together. That can be something. Or if it's separate, maybe kind of do a trade off to help each other. If you have younger
Mm-hmm.
siblings, maybe offer to watch them so your parent can go, check some things off their to do list and have that time to themselves. And then, same thing if you're a parent, maybe take those younger siblings out of the house so that way, that your child who is feeling overwhelmed can have the house to themselves so they can do their homework or they can study or they can do whatever they need to do. And I think most of all, just being there for each other. And, whether that be a shoulder to cry on or, just someone to talk to and someone to listen, whatever that may be, I think just being there for each other is a great way and to navigate that burnout and a big reason why we all have each other. But what about you, Mom? What tips or tricks
Yeah.
do you have of ways to navigate it together?
Well, if you're living in the same house, some of the fun things you can be like, hey, can we go take a walk? Or one thing we used to do, hey, can we go get some ice cream?
Hmm.
Or, now we'd be more likely to be like, let's go down the street and get a coffee. Or
Uh-huh.
I'm going to run to QT. That's our awesome gas station here in Kansas. Can I bring you a drink? Just some of those real quick kind of put pep in your step kind of little things like, as a parent, we kind of negotiate around here like, okay, you need to do laundry this week. When do you need to do it? I'm going to do it. Like sometimes
Hmm.
I'll go downstairs. I need to do my laundry. I'll go to put myself in the laundry. And I'm like, one of the cues I have to the fact that you're dealing with overwhelm is like, you usually wash your towels last. Your towels are still in the dryer, right?
Hmm.
And so sometimes as a parent, you could get irritated and you could be like, oh, when your laundry day is over, you have to have the stuff out of the laundry room. So the next,
Hmm.
instead, I'm like, oh, Cade must be dealing with some overwhelm. He has a lot on his plate. Let me fold these and take him up and set him on his bed, right?
Hmm.
The things that you can do just to be kind, just being kind
Hmm.
to each other, but or decide to make a special dinner together and actually sit down and eat together. Sometimes it's just taking that pause, or hey, let's watch this movie on Netflix. Are you free at 8 o'clock tonight? And making that plan. Yeah, you could still be doing the laundry or running to the grocery store at 8 p.m., but you're going to wake up probably with a better connection with your kid and a more refueled battery if you take some time to take that walk or
Hmm.
do a puzzle together for a little while or play a game. Those things I think can really refuel you, or plan a vacation that's down the road a little bit. Like help
Hmm.
put something on your calendar that you have together to look forward to as a family. So I think first and foremost, it's just really important to admit when you're dealing with burnout, whether you are the kid or the parent. And it's not just admitting it to yourself, but being able to admit it to someone else. I think a lot of times our egos get in the way and we're like, well, I see all these other people getting all these things done. And like for me, even I see my younger self on my Facebook memories being able to get all these things done. Well, now I'm older. I don't move quite at the same speed and my priorities have shifted, right? I value my
Hmm.
rest and my relaxation much more than I did when I was that age, partially out of necessity. But I
Hmm.
think remembering that, yeah, you might think they're getting all that stuff done, but you don't know how stressed out they are in the moment. So admitting that you're burnout and not letting your ego get in the way, because everybody deals with burnout at some point in time. They might not admit it to you, the people out there, right? But your family should be a safe place where you can admit it to each other. You don't have to suffer through it alone. You and your bigs can really support each other and share ideas on how to make that more balanced or blended existence, right? The norm in your household. We don't have
Hmm.
to accept the high pressure, high stress mentality that's fed to us by the outside world. So we can make a different choice for ourselves, for our families. We can make a different choice both as a big and a parent. Our homes and lives can be structured differently. We can create a life where we have both productivity and rest, activity and recovery, ambition and calm. So it is a choice. How do you want to go through life? Choose wisely. So, Kate, is there any other thoughts you have to close us out here on dealing with feelings around burnout?
For sure. I think it's just important to remember that burnout is everybody's going to experience at some point in time. Some people experience it more often than others. Some people experience it less. Some people experience it easier than others. Sometimes it only takes
Mm,
one or two things to feel burnt out. For some people and other people, they can let it pile on before they start to feel burnt out. But it's important to recognize those feelings and figure out how to navigate them for yourself. Like I said earlier, what works for some people is not going to work for others. So just figuring out what way it works best for you to navigate those feelings, check those things off your to-do list, and maybe make that a little bit easier and a little bit easier to digest. But yeah, that's really all I have to say. Unless you have anything else, Mom, I think that is a wrap for this episode of Raising
mhm.
Bigs. We thank you all for listening today. We hope you found some takeaways, a fresh perspective, and maybe even an action step or two in this episode. Above it all, we hope it opens an opportunity for conversation between bigs and their parents. We are definitely not experts, but we can authentically share what we're learning in hopes of making the path a little bit easier for those who are listening. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Please subscribe and share with those in your circles who you think might benefit from hearing it or just might enjoy listening to the episode. A new episode gets released on all three of those platforms every single week.
You can also visit my life coaching website at marcyhawkinson.com or email me at lifecoachmarcy@gmail.com. I'm also on Facebook at Life Coach Marcy and Instagram at life_coach_Marcy. And where can our listeners find you, Kate?
My handle across all social media platforms is at @thecade That's where you can find me. The best way to contact us, whether you want to give us feedback or ask a question, is to DM either one of us on social media or to reach out on the contact me page on my mom's website. Again, that is marcyhawkinson.com. We appreciate any feedback, questions, or topic ideas that you may like to share, and we will see you next time on the next episode of Raising Bigs.